Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Speranza, the Director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program here at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to help kick off today's event focused on Russia's upcoming major strategic military exercise, Zapad 2021, and the implications for NATO in terms of military mobility, but also broader defense and deterrence efforts in Europe. This is part of a series of conversations CEPA has hosted on shared challenges for the alliance with our partners at NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, so we thank them for the fruitful cooperation. Well, it's quite a timely conversation today, almost a month ahead of the official start of Zapad 2021, although there's some movements underway already, which I hope we can discuss in a moment. Zapad, of course, has captured the attention of analysts and military watchers and allied and partnered policymakers because it's a major stress test of the Russian military, their capabilities, their readiness, and mobility in its Western military district, essentially for some kind of full-scale war scenario with NATO. It's also a test of Russia's integration of Belarusian forces, which is particularly interesting given the political crisis and civil unrest in Belarus recently, and Russia's recent military buildup near Ukraine's border this past spring, which was never fully drawn down. Zapad 21 also follows US President Joe Biden's first summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin and continued Russian meddling in NATO and ally partner countries. So against this turbulent geopolitical backdrop, there is much to unpack about what we can expect from Zapad, what this exercise might signal about Russia's intentions and capabilities, and perhaps where the alliance should do more to enhance its own defense and deterrence efforts going forward. So to do that, we have an incredible lineup of transatlantic speakers with us today. Retired General Ben Hodges, who's Pershing Chair here at CEPA and former commander of US Army Europe, as well as former commander of NATO's Allied Land Command in Izmir. We have retired Admiral George Zambellis, who is the former First Sea Lord and former Chief of the UK's Royal Navy. We have Egla Murauskaite, who is senior researcher and simulation designer at the University of Maryland, but based in Vilnius, Lithuania in the region. And Alex Tiersky, who is senior policy advisor at the US Committee on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the Helsinki Commission, who has worked with the Congressional Research Service, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the State Department. So thank you all so much for joining us. We've got a really great lineup, and I'm keen to hear from all of you and dive in to some opening questions for each of you. So I'll ask everyone to kind of keep their initial responses concise, and then we can move to a bit of a back and forth with some of the questions that I've collected from our network. So Admiral Zambellis, I'd love to start with you. And could you just start us off with painting a picture, a little bit of scene setting? From your own perspective, why does Zapad 2021 matter in a strategic context? And why should the West be paying attention, especially this time around?
Thanks, Lauren, and great to be with you and to join this illustrious team. I think a few quick opening comments from me would just put Zapad 2021 in context. I think we must remember that this is a continuation of a series of, as you call them, stress testing exercise. I shouldn't forget that these are designed to push the readiness and the capabilities of Russia's forces in the Western military district. The context in which those exercises take place, I believe, is changing. I think there will be more attention to this exercise than we've seen in previous ones for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, we at the strategic level, you asked me to comment about the strategic level, where we've got some particular dimensions. I think the one that's most obvious is that the whole US, NATO, and Russian relationship under the Biden administration continues to be tested. And I also think there's an interesting concurrent test going on in the Gulf at the moment, with the new Iranian presidency teasing the US administration indirectly through some of the shipping attacks and the Israeli connections. And the relevance of that through my own maritime lens is that is a testing and teasing process at the strategic level, looking to see how administrations respond. And the other thing I think at the strategic level has got a slightly different twist to it, is that normally Belarus is invisible, if you like, to the global commentariat. But weirdly, because just recently 2 of their Olympians have refused to go home and are seeking political asylum in Japan, we're now finding that people around the world understand what Belarus is, and they're more focused on the regime and the opposition, And I believe that may end up reflecting somewhat on the attention the globe pays to Zapad 2021. So moving on from what you might call the conventional military perspective, there are some interesting new strategic dimensions. And I'm sure you'll come back to me on the Black Sea and issues to do with maritime freedom of maneuver later on in questions. But there's a few opening comments for you.
Excellent, Admiral. Thank you so much. Great way to start off at the top level. And General Hodges, maybe I could come to you to follow that. I mean, there's somewhat of a debate going on about, what's Zapad and what's not Zapad. And I think this is part of the Russians' approach. So even before the official start of the exercises in September here, what movement have we already started to see on the ground from Russia in and around the Western Military District in preparation for the exercise? And if I could ask you maybe just to put yourself back in your old chair as U.S. Army Europe Commander, what are some of the things that you'll be watching for?
So first, of course, I would like to echo Admiral Zambellis' comments about the broader context. I think that is important. And, we've got Belarusian protest organizers found hung in a park in Ukraine. 2 others, their trial just started. Remember the Olympic team, where they tried to force her to come back home. Fortunately, Poland's going to offer her a humanitarian visa. So this what's going on in Belarus is not isolated or irrelevant to this exercise, because it sets a tone for what's going on in there and what's inside the head of President Lukashenko, who has made it clear that Russian soldiers would be welcome to stay in Belarus. So these things are connected. Secondly, 6th Tank Brigade already deploying elements into Belarus for the Zapad exercise significantly sooner than what we saw 4 years ago. So that, from a practical standpoint, obviously creates opportunity for more training, for more preparations, and so on. But that's not cheap. Now, this is expensive. And, people who are doubters about Russia's ambitions say, come on, why are you so worried? They have the GDP of Italy. The amount of money that the Russians are putting into an exercise like this is not inconsequential. And then when you think about how much capability is still in place in and around Ukraine from just about 3 months ago, the Admiral can talk much more clearly about the Black Sea Fleet than I can, but 80,000 or so soldiers are still there, and all their stuff is still there. So even though they may not be earmarked for Zapad, they're in the area. And that really goes to the challenge of understanding what is and what is not Zapad. The Russians have never, ever been transparent or honest about what's in the exercise. And unfortunately, there are too many people in Berlin and Brussels and Paris, and unfortunately, even in Washington, that are willing to say, okay, well, we don't want to provoke them. And I'm not sure that that's actually, they didn't exceed the 13,000 or whatever. And so this lack of transparency is what scares the hell out of people in Lithuania and Estonia and Poland and me, as well as our partners in Ukraine. So I think this is a place where Germany should be pounding on the Kremlin to live up to its own agreements with, and as part of the OSCE, to be transparent. And let me close with this. I'm a little worried that our new administration is already starting to show elements of, hey, we don't want to provoke the Russians, as if the Russians need provocation. And so we're already starting to feel, I'm starting to hear bits about what are some things that we can do with our exercises to be more transparent, as if somehow that will persuade the Russians to be more transparent. It won't. We are all, I've had, when I was commander of U.S. Army Europe, we had Russians flying over our drop zones, in our barracks, going through our command posts. I love that. You'll never get that on the other side. And then the other thing I do worry that we have to watch out for, I think the administration is already beginning to consider scaling back on the size of our exercises, again, as a way to avoid provocation of the Kremlin, which is exactly the opposite if you understand how the Kremlin thinks.
Thank you, Ben. Lots of food for thought there. And I definitely want to pick up on those transparency points with Alex here in a second. But first, Egla, I was wondering if I could come to you to talk a little bit about the Belarus issue, which we've teed up a little bit already, but you've been following this from Lithuania, from the region. So from your perspective, how does Belarus fit into this exercise kind of militarily, but also with some of the broader dynamics that Admiral Zambellis and General Hodges have alluded to? I mean, do you expect Russia to maybe leave behind some forces, or are there some unconventional signals we should be watching for here?
Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me on this panel, and it's a real honor to be in such a great company. Just to pick off on something that's already been laid on the table, really Belarus has become sort of one of the focal points this time, not just because it's nice to defend democracy around the world, but essentially because the situation, the relationship is changing between Belarus and the West, specifically Europe, and Belarus and Russia. So let's say if we remember Zapad 2017, the relationship that Lukashenko was trying to cultivate was that of balancing Russia and sort of reassurances towards Europe. And really, there were observers from the Baltic states of the exercise, and he was just basically going out of his way to assure that no, there's not going to be any components of the Russian military or technology staying afterwards. Right now, it's basically a 360 turnaround to this, right? We've already seen pre-positioning of a lot of equipment. I'm not exactly sure that the staying factor is of such significance here. I'm sure the general and the admiral can elaborate on that. But really, one of the most significant aspects from the military standpoint, the way I see it, is the modernization potential for this, right? Because you're seeing for this exercise enormous movements of really upgraded equipment, weapons, especially aerial, all kinds of aerial technology. And it's a real good way to swap out the older technology for the new technology without showing a numeric increase, which is also part of what's being monitored. So that's one thing that I'm watching for and sort of would be wary about. But the other thing is really this much broader contextual, much broader context that this is unfolding that the panel has already alluded to. And it is growing hostility and confrontation even between the EU and Belarus. Lithuania, one of the states that constitutes the external border for Europe with Belarus, has been at the forefront of some of these hybrid situations that sort of beg the question, what is and isn't Zapad. So for one thing, I'm sure everybody's heard by now about the migration situation, which is not so much a problem in numbers as it is in the intent, in the sort of manipulation and leveraging of the migrant flows, where people are being flown in via airplane. And the other thing is that Lukashenko seems to be delivering on his other threats of upping the ante on illicit trafficking, because a considerable amount of cargo from Belarus has been moving through Lithuanian territory. And already the officials are reporting a significant uptick in the movement of illicit goods. I'll just remind everyone that among the threats, Lukashenko has mentioned the prospect for movement of WMD and dual-use materials. So I'll leave it at that, but we'll be happy to elaborate as the panel goes on.
Thank you, Egla. That was fantastic and great to understand more about why there is so much focus on the Belarus element this time. Alex, I would love to come to you next to unpack what we've started to talk about with this transparency element. I mean, from the perspective of the Helsinki Commission and the OSCE, transparency around these large military exercises really is paramount, as outlined in the Vienna document. And oftentimes having observers at these exercises is a huge part of that. And as someone who was present to observe the last iteration of Zapad in 2017, maybe you could say a word about how Russia has been approaching this reporting and observation element and what we might expect this time around.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks to SIPA for organizing this really interesting and timely conversation. And thanks to General Hodges really for kicking off the conversation on transparency, which is really a piece of this that I try to watch pretty carefully. I think the first thing I want to do is make sure our audience understands why if Russia is at least theoretically exercising on its own territory or on the territory of Belarus where it's been invited, why we should have any kind of expectation whatsoever that we would have, as you say, observers or some kind of idea of what's going on there. After all, we exercise continually. Well, what I want to underline here as a starting point and really as the baseline is Russia is a participating state in the OSCE, and it is a signatory to, as you mentioned, the Vienna document. This is a set of confidence building measures that requires, in order to reduce the risk of conflict, different participating states, different signatory states to declare their intentions when they're going to have exercises, which could otherwise be misunderstood and potentially be prelude to aggression. There are thresholds involved. That word has been thrown out on the table already. So for example, as General Hodges said, one of the thresholds is if you're going to have some sort of unusual military activity featuring more than 13,000 troops, that triggers certain requirements in terms of what you need to do to invite observation from all of the other OSCE participating states to ensure transparency and essentially reassure everyone. So that brings us back to, yes, I was at the final phase of Zapad 2017 personally, but what I want to underline is that in no way should be misunderstood as a meeting of transparency commitments by Moscow. I was there for under a very specific set of circumstances having to do with a congressional delegation that had traveled to Belarus in the months before. We had raised this with President Lukashenko, as well as human rights and political freedoms issues. And I was there at the invitation of the government of Belarus, seeing essentially the final fireworks show, which should in no way be understood to be the kind of transparency that is required of Vienna document signatories, and in particular the Russians here. You asked for a couple of words on generally, what is Russia's been approach since then. So I've underlined Zapad 2017 was not an example of meeting transparency. Certainly that has continued to be the case, sadly. The best example, of course, is the buildup that's been mentioned in and around Ukraine in late March, early April. 100,000 soldiers, hundreds of pieces of major equipment were there. There was no notification by the Russians about what it was about. Ukraine availed itself of its tools at the OSCE and requested additional information. The Swedish chairmanship of the OSCE, they're in charge for this calendar year, they scheduled a meeting to dispel concerns. The Russians boycotted that meeting. So in a sense, they've continued to deliberately obfuscate and not meet their transparency requirements. Now, my last word on this is it seems as we lead up to this September's iteration of Zapad, there's no indication that this approach has changed. My understanding is there was a notification, at least, of the exercise over the weekend to the OSCE participating states. From what I understand, the numbers involved are still really too low to be credible. So again, it doesn't appear that Moscow has any intention of meeting its transparency requirements. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Really, really helpful to lay that foundation of understanding of why we so often talk about size and the numbers and the requirements under the OSCE banner. So thank you for that fundamental understanding there. Admiral Zambellis, I'd like to come back to you before we kind of get to the Black Sea specific set of issues, which I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on. But one of the things that we see with Russian exercises in the past is its ability to kind of use hybrid warfare, blend some non-conventional and conventional forces and tools, and to test new types of concepts and technologies. And I know you've been thinking a little bit about the tech aspect of this. So I wondered if you could say a quick word about, how do you expect Russia to integrate some of these non-conventional tools like cyber, or test some other kinds of new technologies? We've seen recent developments in Russian military robotics and some of these other kinds of things. Do you think that we'll see any of that in Zapad 21?
Well, I think there are some very straightforward answers I can give you to that. And the first thing we have to do is to recognize that Zapad 2021 is looking to test and prove and build confidence in private. We won't have visibility of a lot of the strategic and operational objectives, because just as we do with our own exercises in NATO and in the West, we have a multiple layer approach to the exercise objectives, the training objectives. Some of these literally rest at the highest levels of command, the command's ability to understand the concept of agility in time and space and the use of technology. Some of it descends down to what you might call the operational planning. So they're pre-programmed events that occur in sequence in order to test your troops and to test the more junior commanders. And so really the best way to imagine this is a quite a mixed cake of both fixed and variable factors in the strategic and operational use of technology. I mean, I think that if I were to rest my sort of cursor on one area that is important to discuss, it's how data is coordinated across the entire battle space to achieve the right levels of effect. Some of that is at the strategic level to do with strategic messaging, the coordination of time and space to achieve really significant effects on a potential enemy. And some of it is the coordination of operational and tactical data. And we've seen some of this in the exploitation of the Azeri-Armenian action, where we suddenly find ourselves observing the really effective utilization of autonomous systems and coordinated use of data in a way which hasn't been seen or wasn't seen more overtly before. So going back to my first point on the need to test, prove, and build confidence, I would guess that the Russians will be looking to try to test and prove a number of these net-centric issues to their satisfaction. The maritime dimension is important because one of the, I think, fallouts of the British destroyer Defender's transit of the Black Sea recently was the fact that the Russians didn't really coordinate or understand exactly what was going on quickly enough. And some of their reactions had the capacity to be an overreaction, all of which is part of the danger and complexity of the operational theater with strategic consequences. So it's the movement and coordination of data which I think will lie at the heart of their ambition in the design of the exercise, whatever we see by way of troop movements and conventional video clips.
Thank you, Admiral. That's really helpful. Well, speaking of kind of testing and proving concepts and practicing things in real life, General Hodges, I mean, one of the things this exercise will test is logistics, presumably, and military mobility, as we talk a lot about at SIPA, and you have really been the leading voice on. So could you talk a little bit about what we could expect to see from the logistics standpoint? What will this exercise tell us about military mobility, Russia's ability to move personnel and forces quickly near the European theater?
I really like what Egla said earlier, how the exercise is an opportunity to kind of change and upgrade without drawing too much attention to it. And so that when you wake up one morning, it's like, holy hell, how did they have this here? And I would anticipate the same thing for logistics. You know, the Russians, even though there were no Russian troops stationed in Belarus for the last few years, which obviously was a good thing, they have logistics, storage, depots, fuel, ammunition, et cetera, that are there. And so I would anticipate that we'll see a regeneration, upgrade of logistics infrastructure. That's the hard stuff to move. You can have paratroopers come in, you can have tanks on trains come in. The hard bit is the millions of liters of bulk fuel that are needed, ammunition, field hospitals, those kinds of things. So I anticipate that they will use the exercise as an opportunity to bring stuff in and leave things behind. Those to me are the big indicators. The other thing that I've always been impressed with about Russian land forces is their ability to move a lot of stuff real far, real fast. Now their mobility challenge is different from ours. I mean, it's all inside Russia or in Belarus, of course. So you've got one gauge of rail. They're not too fussed about having to get permissions to move around. They got priority for rail cars. They have a significant logistical capability in terms of that, and also large aircraft. I mean, you remember when the peacekeeping force was sent to Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, like within 2 days of the decision or the announcement to do this, you've got dozens of these gigantic Antonov aircraft flying troops into Armenia and then for en route into Nagorno-Karabakh. That's impressive. So these are the kind of things that I think all the pros in U.S. European Command and at NATO and in the other nations will be watching closely as the logistics for what goes in, what comes out, and what can we learn from their capability, much the way the Admiral talked about learning from what they do from a higher technology standpoint. And this is why I think mobility is so important for us. Deterrence is about speed of recognition of what's happening, speed of decision, and speed of assembly. How fast can we put, whether it's troops or ships or planes, in place to prevent a crisis? And so having the ability for NATO forces to be able to move as fast or faster than Russian Federation forces to a place is essential to effective deterrence. I'm encouraged by what the EU is doing in this regard. I'm encouraged by what the alliance is doing. We're still about 5 years behind, but I'm encouraged by at least the direction of travel. And now NATO is talking about, the alliance is adopting EU language in terms of something they call the mobility project. So instead of military mobility, they're talking about the mobility project that's focusing on developing more heavy equipment transports that are needed to move armored vehicles rapidly down a highway, and also increasing the amount of mobile bridging for the dozens of large rivers that would have to be crossed in Poland and in Eastern Europe. The last thing I would say is, I just get weary always hearing about how we got to be careful that we don't provoke the Russians. I mean, since they invaded Georgia in 2008, they have only increased their aggression and their control of territories all along their periphery. It's worse now than it was in 2007. And so I think it's time that we figure out how to get the initiative and have them respond to us instead of us always wringing our hands. I mean, like General Breedlove said one time, he goes, when are we going to get provoked? I'm tired of hearing about we might provoke the Russians. And so maybe a mobility exercise where you have US or NATO troops conduct a movement from Poland into Yavoriv, for example, the Ukrainian training area, where you have to cross the border, you have to change rail gauge, you have to move stuff. Or my favorite would be one from Romania around the corner of the Black Sea to the Ukrainian training area called Shroiki Line, which we use already during Sea Breeze. These things would, I think, help give us initiative as well as help Ukraine develop improve its own mobility.
Thanks, Ben. Lots of good practical recommendations in there, I think, for where the alliance is doing well, but also where we need to do more, specific things that we could try. So thank you for that. I wanted to pick up on what General Hodges is saying about speed of recognition and the alliance's ability to understand what's happening on the ground. I mean, you're in your day job someone that works on simulations and thinking about possible scenarios and as decision makers, what we should be planning for and preparing for. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, what are some of the dynamics that you think allied decision makers need to be thinking about around this exercise? I mean, one of the nightmare fears is that this could be some kind of Trojan horse for some kind of Russian maneuver like we saw in Ukraine, or is it just a distraction for something else that Russia might be planning? So do you have any thoughts on kind of dynamics we should be thinking about as the alliance?
Well, the Russians seem to have no limit for the ability for strategic surprise in the West, and every time NATO and the US seems to be caught flat-footed. It seems that from a great number of simulations that we've run of strategic interactions with Russia, not only in Europe, but in Eastern Europe, but also in the Mediterranean, also with China, like we're seeing the same sort of weak spot that we keep on hitting in the West. And that is something that General Hodges has hinted at. That's the proactivity element. I would, however, emphasize the probably strategic communication and less military aspects in there, because I do have confidence in the regular exercises and sort of capabilities of the joint forces. As has been said, they are moving in the right direction. However, there is just a tremendous gap in the understanding of how to effectively engage and communicate with the public of NATO member states, how to come up proactively with a narrative, how to not always be playing defense on the narratives that are coming out of Russia about what is happening, why things are happening, the simple interpretation of events like, is this a call or is this a response? Is this a provocation or is it a response to a provocation, right? It's like down to that level. NATO member states consistently seem to be in the weak spot here. So I think definitely more sort of whole government approach and much more attention to speedy, efficient strategic communication, engaging with the publics rather than the governments is definitely something that we keep on hammering home in the to-do list. If I may sort of jump also to some of the things to watch and that have been touched upon, not just from a scenario planning, but from the exercises and preparations that we're seeing here on the ground, right? So one thing that has been mentioned a little bit is the data. I would also emphasize the technology side there. Lots of electronic warfare components coming there. And I would say that the key word would be definitely integration, like how successful is the integration? Not only sort of man-to-computer integration and systems integration that has been talked a little bit about before, but also force integration. So how are actually the Russians, how good are they at working with the Belarusian counterparts? Because it is their territory, it is their lead often, even though the authorization, I think we all know where that is coming from. But the pandemic has affected their ability to coordinate and train and cooperate effectively. So this would be like one good indicator to watch, like what is about to happen there. And something that hasn't been really covered is, I think, China. Why China? Russia regularly invites it as to observe, to participate. Sometimes China politely declines. Sometimes, there are things behind the scenes. But I think this time we have seen already in the past couple of months much more pro-Lukashenko supportive rhetoric coming from China than we have ever seen before. And, in the face of the Olympians asking for asylum, in the face of Western condemnation of the treatment of dissidents, China has stood firmly behind Lukashenko's regime. So sort of anything that comes out of this exercise, any lessons learned, any sort of takeaways, any European Belarusian friction, watching what China does, to what extent are they really ready to back up the Lukashenko regime? Are they willing to go beyond rhetoric? I think that's going to be also a very insightful and interesting new angle to observe.
Thanks, Agla. That's really helpful. And you're one step ahead of me on the China aspect. So thank you for putting that on the table. Really helpful. There's a lot to pick up on there, but Alex, I wanted to come back to you because we've talked a little bit about, you made the case for kind of how Russia has been approaching these kinds of exercises, this issue of transparency. We've talked about their ability to do strategic surprise and kind of the alliance's ability to try and anticipate what they might do. From where you sit, what can we do to kind of encourage better transparency or to try and increase this strategic communication with Russia to better capture some of these exercises, to increase overall kind of transparency between Russia and the alliance? Are there any efforts underway or kind of things that you can speak to from the OSCE or from the Helsinki Commission's perspective, things that we ought to do more of there?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. I think the first thing I want to do is split this into short term and longer term. In the short term, I absolutely pick up on what Egla brilliantly said, which is there's a huge strategic communications part of how we are reacting in the lead up to Zapad 21 and during the exercise. And I think the messaging, the appropriate messaging from where I sit is and the messaging that needs to be put out both verbally and through our action is we are paying attention, we are watching carefully, we understand the strategic picture, but we are not panicking. This is not a panicked conversation. I think there's no need to kind of amplify the rhetoric that might be coming from the other side that would want to create additional instability through panic. So that's the short-term version. In the longer term, I think we can address some of the ways that Russia is deliberately undermining the system of transparency and predictability. I think it was General Hodges who mentioned that they chop up their exercises where different types of military activity that to our mind is clearly one exercise. They say these things are unrelated, so none of them are independently triggering of an observation mission. They simply declare lower numbers than are realistic. And then there's another loophole that we haven't mentioned, which is if they continue to declare their exercises as snap exercises without notification to the troops, there is a loophole for that under their commitments at the OSCE and in the Vienna document. So the good news is that there is a diplomatic process underway at the OSCE led by the United States. We are joined by 34 participating states of the OSCE in a joint proposal that would address some of these problems. Now, you can say, of course, Russia is unlikely to play ball and unlikely to want to adopt these measures, which after all are at the OSCE are adopted by consensus. So that's why, it's a long-term proposition. It's important to make these efforts to ensure this system of transparency and predictability is viable for the long term, and that our friends, partners, and allies understand that it's something that we value. And again, something that General Hodges mentioned, we do lead by example through this system. Let me check my notes here. The most recent exercise this spring, Defender Europe, to my understanding, we notified it in November of 2020. There was a second notification in March 21 with additional details. We briefed the OSCE participating states voluntarily, including Russia, in April. And then we also provided a briefing directly to the Russian Ministry of Defense. I think those types of measures aren't likely to flip Moscow's views into suddenly providing perfect transparency, everything that we would like to see, particularly in the short run. But in the longer term, I think these are important things to kind of buttress an international system that, after all, benefits us. I also, of course, work for Congress, and I would say this is something that a number of the members that I work with have spoken to. Senator Roger Wicker, I'm thinking of Congressman Richard Hudson. In fact, Congressman Hudson is a senior member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. He chairs a committee there. He recently hosted a conversation for members of the Assembly on promoting transparency and predictability in military affairs and this Vienna document implementation issues. So I think, again, this isn't likely to solve the problem in the short term, but I think underlining the extent to which Moscow's actions undermine not only international norms, but their own commitments allows us to challenge their assertion that their actions are perfectly normal and essentially there's nothing to see here and why is everyone getting so upset. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. And General Hodges, I know you've got a two-finger.
Yeah, first of all, I can't say anything better than what Alex said. I would like to add, this is where Germany needs to step up. I think Berlin is the only capital that can actually influence Kremlin behavior. And so now's the time for the White House to get a return on their investment of rolling over on this Nord Stream 2, say, all right, Germany, let's see you show some leadership and put pressure on the Kremlin to live up to OSCE commitments and Vienna documents. This kind of pressure, I think, would be useful. And it's the kind of the thing that the Germans would prefer to do anyway, and privately or whatever, but exert some real pressure, along with the French, perhaps. I think that is a way to help influence it. And then, as Alex highlights, the way that we do it helps keep our own team on side. I mean, you don't get our European friends saying, well, America, you guys are just as bad. The what about type of stuff. We have journalists riding in almost every vehicle. I mean, we're covered with journalists, so you can see everything that we're doing. And I think leading by example is an important part of it. Excuse me for intervening there, but Alex got me fired up because it is such an important part of this.
No, it really is. Thank you. Thank you both. Really, really helpful. Admiral Zambellis, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned in your last intervention, which was about the HMS Defender incident in the Black Sea. And as we think about this question of Russian behavior and Russian intentions, how did you assess what happened there? I mean, we saw sort of dangerous harassment by the Russian military of allied ships, and there was lots of, I think, questions about what that incident tells us about Russian intentions. I mean, did you see that as an increased willingness by the Kremlin to undertake these sort of risky maneuvers against the West? And is that specific only to the Black Sea region, or do you think that has broader spillover effects in other parts of Europe? And kind of how do you think that the alliance should be responding to that?
I think it has broader spillover effects elsewhere. I mean, sometimes the maritime dimension is sort of seen in isolation, and in the Zapad 21 exercises, I think it's quite important that the strategic level leadership understands the totality of the battle space and extends that properly into the maritime and properly into space, not yet mentioned. And by that, I really mean that when you're dealing with the distribution of influence, effect, military effect, political effect, it's got no boundaries to do with the domains. They're all integrated, they're all connected by data. So what was revealing about the Defender incident, if I can call it that, and this is my own interpretation, just to keep us safe, is that it was a surprise as to the Russians that the incident occurred in the way it did, and that their responses appeared to be as unsophisticated as they were, and were seen to be unsophisticated. That I think will create a lot of soul searching not in the maritime community, because this is a bigger piece than the maritime. This is about the coordinated strategic response and the fast decision-making required to move an issue from what appears to be the tactical to the strategic rapidly, with safe steps in between. So going back to your question, I mean, I think that whether you see maritime activity in support of Zapad 21 in the Black Sea, in the Baltic, and frankly, anywhere, it's all part of the coordinated effect, and it would be, in my view, part of the coordinated design. And just remember that at the end of the day, it is about weapon systems, logistics, and effects all being manipulated for strategic purposes. And therefore, I am quite keen to get the message across. The maritime must not and cannot be seen in isolation.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I wondered if you had any follow-on thoughts about, while we're not thinking about the maritime domain in itself, I mean, do you think that Russia has a particular advantage or sees the maritime domain differently than the alliance in terms of its ability to rapidly use the maritime domain to mobilize forces and to move quickly? I mean, how do you think Russia sees the maritime domain, whether it's part of, Zapad or kind of more broadly?
I think that's a great question, because I think the answer is quite shocking. I think the Russians see the maritime domain as a particularly useful operational battle space in the way that NATO doesn't. NATO tends, in its operational contribution by contributor nations, to pursue what I call ungenerously as lowest common denominator contributions, which is where the individual national politics tends to be quite cautious about what stance it takes. So, for example, Defender was physically alone in the transit of the waters, as previously described, although, of course, ships are not next to each other in order to be coordinated tactically and operationally anymore, not like some people imagined. But the important point really is that Russia is not restricted in its participant performance by individual units or by contributing elements to the maritime in the way that NATO is. So I've always felt that although NATO has significant military capability, it's got a much higher mountain to climb when it comes to really important and coordinated effects between its forces.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, Ben, I wanted to come to you just to help as we start to wrap up the conversation here, to think about kind of what will success look like from the Russian perspective of Zapad 21. And maybe as you talk about that, both in terms of capabilities, but also kind of Russian narratives around the exercise, what they want to get out of this, and if there's any comparing and contrasting you can do about what that will look like compared to what it did in 2017 in the last round. That would be really great.
So first of all, I've always been impressed with Russian exercises because they use them to test things. And I think professional militaries know that you have to train to failure. You have to exercise up to the point where you discover the gaps and the problems and the seams and that sort of thing. And so the Russians seem to be, which is in a way almost counterintuitive on their exercises, seem to be willing to train to find that point of failure and then get after it. So that's impressive to me. And I think the things that have been highlighted already this morning that they'll be working on are an example of that. I suspect that probably a more focused effort this time than even last time. The second sort of key thing that as I think about this, this is going to be a very long, hot summer for Ukraine. I think when you think about the thousands of troops, the ships, all the capability they're sitting in and around Ukraine still, the fact that every day in Donbass, there are dozens of ceasefire violations, that 45 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed during the so-called ceasefire. This is not a game. And yet, for some reason, so many of us in the West continue to be surprised, like, I can't believe they would do that. Or I hear from very senior Germans, like, come on, Ben, why are you so worried? Why would they do this? Well, they wouldn't if they thought like we did, but they don't. They obviously have a different approach. And when they see how the West does not, or is almost in disbelief, and I'm talking about west of Poland, obviously, then they feel there's no incentive for them to stop. I would say that Russia will only stop when they are stopped. And so our exercise program should not mirror what they do. Alex's words comment about not panicking, I think that's very important. But what we absolutely should not do is get into this mode of, okay, look, we got to focus on China. Let's just don't provoke Russia. Hey, I'm really sorry, Ukraine. I'm really sorry, Georgia. I'm really sorry, Poland. But we got to focus on something bigger and longer term. And the United States has got to continue to exercise. We have to exercise to failure. We have to test these things. It is so hard in the best of conditions when you go out to the field for the first 2 or 3 days of any exercise, even if it's all inside your own national unit, just to make all your comma work. I mean, to get all the ones and zeros lining up and in a field environment, that's hard as hell. So imagine when you've got 5, 7, 8 nations coming together in a crisis or pre-crisis environment without the benefit of a 6-month buildup, and you just plug in and expect to be able to communicate over secure networks with Five Eye and non-Five Eye, NATO and non-NATO units under pressure in a contested EW environment. You have to exercise that. Battalions and squads, ships, crews, they can practice some things locally or even with simulation, but all the big stuff, the logistics, the communications, understanding who reports to who in a multinational, this is really, really hard, even in ideal circumstances. So our exercise program needs to be at a scale and a rigor that does that, which means political leaders have got to protect senior military officials. You remember a few months ago, Poland, this will be my last point, Poland conducted a large command post exercise, their winter exercise. And General Andrzejczyk, who is an exceptional talent, modern thinking officer, he did this. He exercised, and after 5 days in the exercise, Russian forces were on the Vistula River. So the headline that came out is, what a disaster. I think he should be promoted because he had the courage to be willing to, okay, let's go find out, does this new equipment work? Who talks to who? And instead, he got a lot of tough criticism. And I think if we're serious about deterrence, about never having to fight, then you have to actually go out and do this. And this is what the Russians are doing. I mean, they're finding those points of failure, and we need to learn from that.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Egla, maybe you could speak to the kind of unconventional side of this. I mean, this exercise obviously fits into Russia's broader strategy of intimidating and interfering with its neighbors. There will obviously be some unconventional aspects around the exercise. So what do you think success will look like from that standpoint for Russia in terms of the narrative, in terms of some of these kind of hybrid elements that you were talking about?
Well, Lauren, let me try to address this in 3 parts. And first, the question that you raised, I think that the Russians definitely have sort of 2-pronged objectives here. First of all, of course, yes to everything that General Hodges was saying, exercising, just seeing how things work. But it's also a demonstration externally of the willingness to invest and to sort of not only sustain, but to advance military technology and to continue investing in very modern military technology in economically rather difficult times, let's admit it. So first of all, a huge emphasis on military advancements, also on some of the doctrinal changes, such as the ongoing conversation about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's been going on for a while. We're sort of hearing about preparations for talks between the US and Russia on non-strategic nuclear warheads reductions. So, you know, what if anything comes out of this exercise to show the Russians real willingness to integrate the nuclear component into their newest thinking? What are they willing, if anything, to sort of scale back in there? So first of all, a big signal about what we're doing with the military and the emphasis on the military. But on the other hand, I think the other sort of strategy that they've been very successful at is simply leveraging internal social schisms in many of their adversarial countries. And let's face it, there is no shortage to the potential inventiveness of the tools to poke NATO with, right? So if you have societies that are sort of fragile because of ethnic tensions, because of tensions even surrounding such issues as post-pandemic fatigue coming out as increasing aggressiveness towards any outgroups, be it LGBT minorities, be it local migrant communities, right? If the tensions are heightened, you only take a pick, right? You finance some protest that might turn violent, you finance an information campaign, and there will always be new tools to poke these sores with. So instead of focusing so much of, oh, what is this new tool that Russia or China is now using? Like, how can we match it? Where do we put it in the escalation ladder? Really, this is sort of sending a signal to NATO and more broadly, the Western NATO partners, about the need to look inwards and do some soul searching about healing those sores, because the problem is a domestic one, and it requires domestic, non-military resources. However, Russia and China are very successfully leveraging these to make it a security issue, to boost whatever they're doing militarily through this angle. So really, it is important not to miss this aspect. So that's sort of in terms of the Russian objectives and what to come out of. I really want to hit on the other 2 points sort of in closing my remarks. One is the definite need to keep an eye out on what's going on in Ukraine, for the simple fact of the attention fatigue to this conflict, which is still ongoing. And there could be more maneuvers that, are of concern during Zapad. And my absolute final remark is the need to start doing much deeper thinking about really what constitutes success for the West. And again, we have seen this in so many exercises that I've run, that essentially you have the red team, be it Russia, be it China, be it non-state actors, confronting US or NATO, or a combination of thereof. What we're seeing our blue teams play most usually is for a return to a status quo ante. So that's good enough, right? In the process, sort of sacrificing the allies and reining in a lot of the international gains that have been made, well, that's seen as just an acceptable loss. We have barely seen any strategies that are more proactive, and sort of the level of ambition, really what the West should strive for, what would constitute success, is really at a historic low. So that's something, food for thought, if you will, for decision makers, as well as, well, the audiences that elect them in the end.
Really important point there, to help us bring that to a close. Thank you, Egla, for raising that. And Alex, maybe I could ask you to round us off here in our last 2 minutes or so, just with a broader kind of word about the general mood on the Hill towards the Russia challenge. I mean, Egla has talked a little bit about China, and Ben has alluded to, U.S. shifting attention towards China, not just in how it might factor into Zapad, but broader strategic U.S. attention on China. I mean, are the Russia challenges and the partners that the U.S. has worked so closely with in Georgia and Ukraine and elsewhere, and this conventional Russian military challenge, is that getting sufficient attention on the Hill? Do you think that we're in a good place there, or is there more to be done?
Thanks, Lauren. From societal schisms and Ukraine fatigue to Congress, I see what you did there, but I am here to tell you, actually, there's a very good story to tell from the congressional perspective, and it's one of consistent bipartisan and bicameral vigilance about the threat to our allies and partners, support for NATO, a desire to push back against Russian aggression on Ukraine and Georgia, and also, tracking emerging hotspots like the Black Sea. I could cite a lot of different evidence, just a couple of bits of pieces on the legislative work. I mean, my bosses are legislating on this kind of stuff constantly. The Senate Armed Services just reported out an NDAA for 22 that adds an additional $50 million in security assistance to Ukraine. Senate Foreign Relations Committee just a couple of months ago, reported out a Ukraine Security Partnership Act that's pretty sweeping in terms of the security assistance that it authorizes, additional partnerships on cyber, corruption reforms, et cetera. So there's all the legislative activity, but I think maybe less well understood by our audience is that members of Congress, yes, that's their primary function, but they're also physically present in the regions that we're talking about. So for example, I had the honor of accompanying a congressional delegation, one of the very first in the post-COVID, let me say that differently, one of the very first since COVID began. And we had a tremendous bipartisan, bicameral group. Where did they choose to go? They went to Estonia to reassure our Baltic allies, including going out to the Russian border. And they went to Bulgaria for a briefing in the city of Varna on the Black Sea to find out how the militarization of Crimea really has changed the strategic picture in the Black Sea. So they're demonstrating in their physical presence, as well as in their legislative work and in their let's say public discourse, a commitment to the region and to addressing some of the challenges that we're talking about. What's new? So that's consistent over time, is the congressional engagement in that respect. What's new and what's different, I think, is the additional focus that's being placed through the United States Congress and legislation on human rights. I'm thinking of the Magnitsky Act, global Magnitsky sanctions. I could mention that an act was just introduced, the Reveal Act, that would name those human rights perpetrators and kleptocrats who have been denied visas, name them publicly. Naming and shaming is a terrific tool.
Great to hear, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing on those issues to keep the spotlight there, Alex. So thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you all so much for the insights and the rich discussions. This certainly shed some light on what to expect from Zapad 2021, what this means for the alliances, kind of deterrence and planning efforts and kind of the broader Russia challenge. So we at SEPA, of course, will continue to follow this set of issues as Zapad gets closer. And I encourage everyone to check out our analysis at sepa.org.